This year has been an exercise in resetting our ambition to think bigger and bolder than ever. And Klarna's story is exactly the inspiration we need. Every year since we launched this report, we've heard the same thing. Policy, regulatory fragmentation, and geopolitics are some of the most pressing concerns in the minds of entrepreneurs. This year, a fifth of founders feel policy is the biggest challenge European tech will face in the next 12 months. But there's uncertainty and confusion about how these issues are being addressed in Brussels and beyond.
So here to discuss how tech is essential to delivering on policy and why understanding policy is so critical to people innovating through tech are two people with truly distinct perspectives. So now let's join Linda Griffin, co-founder of the European Technology Alliance and VP of Global Public Policy at CREE, who's speaking with Executive Chairman of the Institute for Global Change and former UK Prime Minister, Tony Blair.
Thank you, Tom. Tony Blair, welcome to this year's launch of the State of European Tech Report, and thank you for joining us today.
Well, thank you for having me, Linda.
Great, so let's get straight into it. There can be a sense that policymakers often jump on issues that the tech community feel don't matter as much. So if you look at the resources that are going into the GAIA-X discussions around the European cloud, people can sometimes be worried that's potentially creating further walls rather than helping businesses move data around internationally and giving them legal certainty. So my question is quite pointed. Why should we care whether policymakers have a good understanding of technology and whether tech entrepreneurs themselves have a solid appreciation of policymaking?
It's important for the reason you've just given, Linda, because what the policymakers will do in respect of regulation, creating the environment in which companies exist and work and have to conform, that is something that will have a dramatic impact on the way the technology companies develop. Policymakers are going to be talking about that impact technology companies, that impact their growth, their development, the markets they exist and work in. And, you know, a lot of tech founders that I meet want as little as possible to do with government, with bureaucracy, with regulators, but it's a fact of life. And one of the biggest problems we've got today is the gap between the change makers on the one side and the policy makers on the other. And one of the things my institute works on is trying to put the two together because they matter to each other. Technology matters enormously to the development of the economy and society, and policy makers have the power to do good or ill in respect of technology in the tech industry. So I know there's a huge reluctance, certainly on the part of the technology folk to get involved with policymakers, but they really should.
I think I often say to people, it's a case of if you care about who makes the rules that govern your operating environment, you need to engage, and it should be part of your business planning.
Sure, it must be and should be if you want. Well, if you want to grow to a decent size. Yeah. I mean, often if you're in a very specific niche, or maybe you're just going to carry on being quite a small company, but if you've got ambitions to really grow and go into multiple markets. I mean, I remember about 10 or 12 years ago having a conversation with one of the tech founders, what is now one of the giant technology companies, and saying to them, you really should take seriously the fact that as you grow, if you become a giant, the policymakers will want to regulate you and you'll have such an impact on society. There's going to be massive public interest concerns. And they were very indifferent to it at the time, but they're not now today. They've got vast amounts of compliance officers and government affairs people. Now, you don't need to do that right at the start, but you need at least to be cognizant of what's going on in the policy world that can affect your world.
Absolutely. So I'm interested in the issues that founders and policymakers often agree or disagree on. So you were the UK Prime Minister. Your Institute for Global Change has tech policy at the heart of what it does. Your son is a successful tech entrepreneur. Your daughter-in-law a leading tech investor. So your family dinner conversations in a way could be a microcosm of this very debate. When the three of you get together, is there anything in terms of tech public policy that you agree on?
Well, truthfully, Linda, the knowledge of my son and daughter-in-law about technology is so much greater in terms of depth of understanding, that it's more like, they're the teachers and I'm the pupil, really. But I think that there's a broad agreement between us that if technology is the thing that is really changing the world today, and my theory of politics is that the technology revolution is the thing that politicians should concentrate upon, not for reasons of regulation, but for reasons to do with what technology can achieve in terms of development. It should revolutionize and will revolutionize everything from healthcare to education, even to law and order and defense. And one of the specific things the Institute concentrates on is how can tech accelerate development. So today, in much of the developing world, there's no need for them to build the legacy systems of the West. They can use technology to circumvent those. And then, we have a whole program, for example, around agricultural technology and how that can change the way we produce food and consume food. You've got technology is the answer to climate change. There isn't another answer unless you're going to tell the developing world not to consume. So you've got to show them how to consume sustainably. So really, I think for any people who are broad-minded enough to look at the world, not just their own company, this relationship between public policy and technology is vital. Part of the problem is that it's become, for a lot of policymakers, simply about regulation. Whereas the purpose of what the Institute's trying to do is to say, no, okay, there are all sorts of issues on regulation and we should deal with those. They're important issues. But it's about much more than how you regulate technology. It's also about how you harness that technology for public good.
Absolutely. This actually brings me on to this question, which is quite related. So this year's State of European Tech report surveyed respondents said the greatest threat that they perceive to the tech ecosystem in Europe in the next 12 months. First, of course, access to talent and funding. But regulation came a strong third behind in that. So industry on the one hand appears to be quite worried about future policy changes and perhaps the focus on what they might think is over-regulation, but they often don't understand on how to engage in the process effectively. So how can founders realistically engage in Brussels policy discussions without it just being seen as a time sink, I suppose, taking them away from building their business and actually creating jobs?
Yes, there are always two risks when you engage with policymakers. One is the time sink problem. You spend time doing that rather than running the business. And the second thing is that you look as if you're just arguing for special interests, right, and not the public interest. But there are ways of overcoming that. And, the most important thing to realize about politicians is their general problem is actually ignorance. It's not lack of goodwill. So a lot of politicians, if you go and speak to members of the European Parliament or even members of the UK Parliament, any parliament you can think of in Europe right now, the first thing they'll probably want to talk to you about is Facebook and privacy and all of those things, which are all important. But what's vital to show them is that is only one part of the discussion. The other part of the discussion is, for example, how the use of technology can transform healthcare, can reduce costs, extend provision for people, how revolutionary new treatments can be properly utilized, how you want to reorganize your healthcare system so that it's about prevention and not just about cure. A whole series of things.
It's like equality of access.
Yeah, no, of course. And these things are massive. And, we're looking at things now like what's the future of food, right? Which may appear to be very long term, but I think will be upon us quite quickly. And then, the important thing is also for people to realize we've now got a climate change ambition, which is massive. I mean, I think people in the UK, for example, they haven't really got their heads around the fact that our climate ambition, which is now a matter of political consensus, is going to mean we have to double electricity provision in the UK over the next 10 to 15 years.
I don't think that's commonly known.
No, people don't know this at all. Now, that is a massive undertaking. So how are you going to do it? How are you going to show people how to change the demand side of power generation and not just the supply side, which is what people have looked at up to now? So you've got all of these questions in which, for the policymakers, it's vital they understand what technology can do. And this revolution that's going to change everything about the way that we work and live and interact with each other, that is the thing. I mean, And I find when I'm talking to politicians and I say to them, look, you guys should be thinking about technology before you think about anything else. I say, he's obviously been out of power for too long, doesn't quite understand it. And I say to him, no, you're not understanding how the world's changing. In the 19th century, by the way, it took politics decades to catch up with the Industrial Revolution. I mean, for several decades in the 19th century, people were still talking about kind of, landlords and tenants and Whigs and Tories in a very old-fashioned way. And then suddenly, towards the middle of the century, people started to realize, no, the real world thing that's happening is people working in new industrial organizations, people going down the mines, people with all sorts of issues around how industry was going to be changed with massive social and economic impacts. And then politics eventually took them almost until the end of the century to catch up with it. Now, the world moves faster today, but the principle's still the same.
It's interesting, there's a lot of elections coming up in Europe, have just been had, but the discussions are really the same kind of clinchers that were around 20 years ago. There's not really, votes aren't going to be decided on environmental policy. It'll be a nice to have, but I don't think it's really at the centre of these political debates at the moment.
No, it's coming that way. And you can see this, for example, by the advance of the Greens in Germany. But no, it's not. And one of the reasons why a lot of the debate in Europe is around, on the left, quite an old-fashioned, more power to the state agenda, and on the right, towards nationalism, anti-immigrant policies. And by the way, that's also important for tech. I mean, if one of the biggest problems is attracting talent, you've got to have an immigration policy that encourages the talent to come. And one of the problems, I've always thought with Brexit is that the moment you end that European freedom of movement, you're going to make it tougher for the UK to attract tech talent. And yet for the UK, the tech sector is one of the 2 or 3 most important sectors for industrial growth.
Absolutely. I'm glad you've brought up Brexit because we love talking about it. So we won't debate Brexit. Brexit is, it's been done in some form. But looking forward, obviously a lot of major European startups are coming out of the UK still. And we don't want more fragmentation across the European market. How do we ensure that there's more cooperation, or at least that we don't lose the sense of cooperation between the UK and the rest of Europe when it comes to tech policies?
Yeah, I mean, look, the problem with Brexit is you can say that the decision to do it is over and legally we've left. Unfortunately, the consequences are still with us and we have to work through them. And, I've always said this, that Britain will miss Europe, but Europe will miss Britain. And this is one of the areas in which Europe will miss Britain, because I think if Britain was round the table when it comes to technology regulation, you'd actually have a better chance of getting it right. So I think we've got to, if I was back in power today, I would be making cooperation around technology regulation one of the areas that Europe and Britain work on. There's no reason why we can't, by the way, even outside of the European Union. So, in one sense, the UK could set a standard that is more ambitious around technology. But on the other hand, if you end up with 2 completely different systems and you've already got a different system in the US, it's not going to be good. And a recent paper from my institute was suggesting that really you need to try and build a transatlantic bridge on technology regulation between the US and the European Union, because ultimately we're all going to be competing with China.
Yeah, that actually, this is I suppose a timeless question. I think one we've discussed before, but basically we know tech can reach across national and regional barriers, and it's great for us that use those services, but it's notoriously hard to regulate for. So in Europe and beyond, we're seeing a lot more fragmentation. So looking at crypto, new forms of growing food, AI, platform workers' rights, digital health, content, competition, and more data and privacy. This is all fragmenting. Do you think we need a new type of institution to regulate tech?
I think we need a new type of cooperation, sure, and whether that's done or how that's done institutionally, I've got an open mind on. But yes, for sure, because you're right. It's going to be across virtually every area. AI raises huge issues. If food technology becomes as big as I think it will eventually, then that's got a whole series of issues that arise from that. You've got GDPR from Europe already setting a standard in a way, but it's not always clear that that is a standard that's...
It's quite a fragmented standard.
It is. And so it would make a lot of sense for at least the major democracies to come together, because that's the other thing that's happening with the internet. There are countries that are using control of the internet, shutting down the availability of it. And that's also going to be a big problem, because when you come to regulate, there will be different values. I mean, China will have a different value system. It's creating technology and using it in different ways, underpinned by different values and different interests. So we need to get this right, and that's why it's so important that you've got, if I was back in government again today, I would have a very strong linkage between the people creating the change and the people deciding how you regulate it.
Another interesting fact from this year's report was only about a quarter of founders in Europe felt that the regulatory environment had changed for the better over the last year, while 20% felt it had actually gotten worse. So we talked a little bit about what founders, how founders should be engaging more and why, but what can specifically Brussels policymakers do to improve these perceptions? Now, because they're finalising a lot of huge cross-cutting proposals on AI, on competition, on content. What can they do to engage with the community more?
I think, it is a weakness of the European system that they've got quite an old-fashioned view around regulation. And part of the problem with regulation in a fast-moving world is that it becomes out of date very quickly. And there is a case, we've discussed this from an institute perspective of having a principles-based regulation rather than a sort of rule-based.
A list of things you can do.
Yeah, and also that your regulation is, you build within it the capacity for it to evolve without necessitating every time the world moves that you have to introduce a whole lot of new regulation. And I think this is really important to get right, and it's important that there is a clear understanding, between the policymakers and those who are inventing the changes that affect all of us. And I think some European politicians get it very well.
Yep.
I think Macron gets it absolutely, and there are other, sometimes from the smaller countries. I mean, if you look at how Estonia has, changed the whole way government works, there's lots that we can do if we approach it in the right way. But, to be clear, the ambition of the regulators in Europe should be, yes, to prevent harm, but also to enable good and to make sure that we're creating an environment in which Europe is able to compete with the best in the world. Now, there are some good signs. I mean, for the first time this year, I think that the amount of investment flowing into new technology topped $100 billion. You've got, roughly 100 unicorns being created in Europe, many of them actually in the UK. So there's a lot happening. And there's some very good stuff happening, but we need to be on top of it.
Yeah, I often hear from policymakers that regulation is giving Europe a competitive edge, but I'm not really sure how that translates into growth and job. I think having, legal frameworks that are clear so you can grow your business, so you know what the rules are and what they're not, is helpful. But I think the focus can sometimes be a bit skewed, which is quite interesting because this year's report and Politico, they did some research on US big tech being the single most frequently talked about tech-related term with European policymakers. So do you think that Europe is perhaps focusing a little too much on handicapping competition in the US, or do you think it's really focused on enabling its own businesses?
Well, I think the risk is it is too much focused on American big tech without asking the question, why are they all American? So I think if we want to make a reality of European technology, including Britain within Europe for these purposes, you've got to make sure our environment is one that actually encourages it. And there's no doubt that's partly about creating the right ecosystem. Mm-hmm. It's partly about, which we've done pretty well in the UK, by the way, using our universities and research centres as means of generating new technology. But it's also about creating an environment in which people feel they can found companies where there's capital available because you've got the right rules around the use of capital and what happens when people create companies. So, no, I think absolutely there is a strong risk that Europe ends up fearing the big American giants, which I understand for the reasons people have for that, and there are all sorts of issues to do with them. But it would be much better if we at least had equal concentration and how we enable European tech to grow.
That was one of the founding principles behind the establishment of the European Tech Alliance a couple of years ago. I was part of a different European unicorn at the time, and arriving in Brussels, I thought the red carpet would be rolled out for us because we were this great European business, but actually it was hard to get FaceTime with people, and so that's why we got together in the alliance and said, like, European tech companies need to work together to be at the table and part of these conversations.
Yeah, I mean, it is a problem with the European system, and particularly with a lot of people in the European Parliament. Okay, because if you want to get publicity as a member of Parliament, if you're sounding off about American technology company, Facebook, Amazon, etc., Google, how powerful they are, you're not paying the right tax, and all of which are important issues, you probably think you've got a much greater chance of getting publicity than if you say we should be reforming, using technology, the European energy market, so that we don't have to consume the same amount of energy, and can make use of what is obviously going to be necessary, which is a coordination of energy markets across Europe in order to reduce emissions. That's a more complicated thing to get across than, Facebook's peering into your private life.
Harder to make the headlines as well. So in fairness to, I think, our colleagues in Brussels, there is a big focus on, how do we create the next generation of really internationally competitive tech companies coming out of Europe. Are there certain areas that you're particularly excited about that you think Europe might have an edge on?
I think bioscience is one. And then I think energy is another because of the huge ambitions Europe's got.
Yep.
I think around some things I was talking about earlier around food and the future of food and food technology. I think Europe's got lots of. I mean, it's a big market.
It's fertile ground.
Yeah, it's the biggest market. I mean, the European single market is still the biggest commercial market in the world. And I think the other thing is that it's got issues to do with the university sector in Europe. I think the UK is a standout in terms of if you look at the top 100 universities in the world, the UK is up there with the US. I think Europe's got it's got a way to go in terms of how it does all of that, but. No, I think there are real areas, fintech probably as well, if we want to do, but that does depend on getting the regulatory system
very much so
right, and the whole issue to do with digital services, digital currency, these are going to be massive questions, and it will depend, to the point we started with, it will depend a lot on what the regulatory environment is.
Yeah. So speaking of digital currency, question about crypto. So in June this year, El Salvador passed a law making it the first country in the world to accept Bitcoin as legal tender. This was news to me. So more recently, they've actually announced plans to construct a Bitcoin city near a volcano that will be funded solely by cryptocurrency. So how much do you think crypto will play in the future of European tech? And we often obsess about, obviously, the US and China, which we've talked about, but should we be looking to places like El Salvador for inspiration?
So this is where, although I talk a lot about the importance of technology, I'm aware that there's a certain point at which my knowledge falls short. You were mentioning my son and daughter-in-law earlier. When I asked my son to explain crypto and blockchain to me, he did, and I said, I'm not really getting it. So he sent me something called The Idiot's Guide to Blockchain, and I struggled with that too.
Sounds quite useful, actually.
But blockchain for sure has got a huge future and is obviously used a lot. And cryptocurrencies, I mean, I think there are thousands now of companies involved in cryptocurrencies, and it's $2.6 trillion worth of assets in it. I mean, the only thing I think is that there's going to come a point when, again, regulation, when it becomes systemically important, the regulators are going to step in. Yep. And I think the interest that there is in digital currencies, and we've suggested that we have a digital pound, and I'm sure countries will move in that direction. I think you just can't be sure where cryptocurrencies will then fit into it, because of course they're all based on the idea that you cut out the government.
Yeah.
And that's fine until the government decides it doesn't want to be cut out.
Exactly, and I think there's the complexity is an issue, right? When most people, I think, who use the internet don't understand what they're using, we see the same on a different level with online advertising and targeted advertising. Most people don't truly understand the processes involved, and obviously Brussels is concerned about that, understandably, and that's why they're looking at things potentially to regulate advertising online. So it's a case of if most people using certain technology don't understand it, policymakers will often feel the need to step in.
Yes, for sure. And also people are investing money, retail investors. And I mean, look, the world will go cashless. I'm pretty sure about that. And I think there is, I mean, I can see this even in the countries we work in Africa, where fintech is actually accelerating quite fast now. And then I think with cryptocurrencies, I think some of the principles behind it and what people are trying to do, which is really based on a distrust for reasons that are understandable, in many cases justifiable, of state regulators and public policymakers. I think some of the principles behind it will definitely endure, and that's why blockchain is so interesting to people, because it does give you a trusted authenticity in transactions. So all of this I think is really important. What I just don't, I'm not expert enough or knowledgeable enough yet to see is how public regulators respond to crypto when it becomes something that's, impacting everyone's daily life.
Well, perhaps the point then is that those involved in building businesses around crypto need to be engaging now to help these audiences understand.
That is for sure. Otherwise, they're going to suddenly find they're stuck out there.
Yeah, and there'll be concern and worry and fear rather than actually interest and curiosity.
Yes, because I'm sure many of the people involved in these endeavors want to do that. They're motivated by doing good and not just doing well. But in that case, they need to explain to people who are public policymakers what they're trying to do, the right way to regulate it, the right way to set it within the overall financial system.
Right. So final question. Obviously, you talk about your institute is working a lot on these tech issues, and it's working a lot across Africa as well. Do you see a lot, I think there's a lot of really interesting companies and businesses and ideas emerging from that continent. Is there anything in particular that you're excited about that you think we should be taking note of?
Well, I think just to take note of the fact it is exploding.
Yeah.
And, the numbers of startup companies in Africa is growing exponentially all the time, including unicorn companies. And what's interesting is the potential that these companies have to alter the way that the countries work and that public services get developed. And so we're working in roughly 20 different countries in Africa. One of the things we're working on specifically is how we use technology to accelerate that development. And, what we're finding is, having started with the idea, well, there are tech companies in the developed world that it would be great to bring to Africa, and we're doing a lot of that. We're also now finding, no, there are tech companies in Africa, started in Africa by Africans, that we should be partnering with. Now, at the moment, I think for a lot of policymakers in Africa, the knowledge is even further behind.
Right.
But they've got to catch up. And things like how you generate and then use data in some of these countries around issues like healthcare, I think, are of enormous importance. And that's one area we're particularly interested in, is how you will probably have in the future adult vaccination programs, not just for COVID, but for a series of different diseases. That means, you should have a system where you can register those vaccinations, follow them up with the patient. You will generate a huge amount of data that could be immensely valuable for people.
Population level health data is something no one's gotten right yet.
Right, but I think it's a massive area. We're really interested in it. And then you will also find you get these startup companies beginning in Africa that are going to be, I think, quite revolutionary. And you know, in financial payments, for example, I mean, Kenya was in many ways ahead of a lot of the Western world. So, you know, it's a very exciting area. And the other thing I always say to people engaged in building technology companies is think about the developing world, because sometimes, by the way, you'll find a readier audience for what you're doing than you will in the West, because part of the problem when you're disrupting things is that, and this is what anyone knows who's ever tried to reform anything in government, is a whole lot of vested interests come out and stop you proceeding with the reform. Whereas in some of the developing countries, it's, you know, it's a virgin market. They're interested in new ideas, and that they'll give them a welcome if they can see what they can do.
Yeah, focus on the outcome rather than, I suppose, trying to roll back years and years of heavy regulation. Tony, thank you so much for your time today. It's been absolutely fascinating.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Tom and Sarah, back to you.
Thank you so much to both of you. It's not often you get to see such a complex issue explored with this level of insider's knowledge. Before we sign off, you should know that there is much more to explore. The new State of European Tech website has just launched, which has all the data we've talked about today, and will be updated with new information and commentary over the coming year.
Thank you to everyone who made this year's report and today's launch event so rich with valuable insights, from Brixton Village in South London to the Codam Coding College in Amsterdam, from Klarna's headquarters in Stockholm to Volt's head office in Helsinki. Our aim was to transport you to a few of the places where inspirational people are doing extraordinary things, and we appreciate the warm welcome, the wise words, and the food for thought that you shared with us. And thank you also to everyone behind the scenes at Atomico, Good Love, Milltown Partners, AIMSEER and MediaWorks. You all made today possible.
And a final thank you to you. There are a lot of big numbers in this year's report, but the success of Europe's tech ecosystem is really down to people who have the passion, patience and persistence to build something that makes a meaningful difference in our lives. People like you. So we hope you've enjoyed sharing this with us.
Goodbye, and thank you so much for tuning in.
And see you next year. Goodbye.